In the past couple of days, the war in Iran has rapidly expanded. Instead of retaliating directly, Iran reacted to the American and Israeli air campaign by launching attacks at military and non-military targets across the region, destabilizing not just the Middle Eastern, but now global economy, with Qatar's energy minister warning on Friday morning that, unless the war winds down very soon, global oil prices could go as high as $150 a barrel, and, quote, bring down the economies of the world. So, in this video, we thought we'd take a look at how the war in Iran is already affecting the global economy, and how much worse it could get. On the night of the 2024 US election, Donald Trump told his supporters that God had saved his life for a reason, alluding to the assassination attempt on his life a few months earlier. In the latest edition of Too Long, we explore how faith-fueled populism, from Donald Trump to Vladimir Putin, has slowly been reshaping modern democracy. That's just one of 72 pages in the magazine, because as always, there's more to Too Long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So, as we see it, the war in Iran poses three big risks to the global economy. First, and most obviously, it's disrupting global energy markets. Second, it's disrupting global food markets. And third, it creates a new risk for financial markets. Let's start with energy. Since the war kicked off last week, and especially since it started to look like it might last a while, energy prices have surged. Brent crude, the global benchmark for oil prices, has gone from about $70 a barrel last month to over $85 at the time of writing. This sort of understates the severity of the increase as well, because oil is priced in dollars, and the dollar has also surged, as investors flock to traditional safe assets to hedge against this new political risk. The so-called dollar index, for instance, which measures the strength of the dollar against a basket of other currencies, has risen by 3 points in the past week or so. Similarly, European natural gas prices have nearly doubled, rising from €30 per megawatt hour to more like €50 at the time of writing, although things are still nowhere near as bad as they were after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Jet fuel prices have followed a similar trajectory, reaching a 4-year high on Thursday. This is largely because Iran has effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway between the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman that is the only sea passage from the Persian Gulf to the open ocean, and thus how most Middle Eastern hydrocarbon exports get to the rest of the world. To give you a sense of quite how important the strait is for global energy markets, last year about 20% of all oil consumed globally went through the strait, with the majority going to markets in Asia. Anyway, when the war broke out last week, insurance costs spiked and traffic fell, but there was still some oil getting through. However, when Iran started actively targeting tankers a couple of days ago, traffic effectively fell to zero, with dozens of oil-laden tankers now sitting idle in the Persian Gulf. Trump has tried to get things moving again by offering insurance backstops and naval escorts, but this hasn't worked so far. To make matters worse, Iran has also started actively targeting energy infrastructure in nearby countries. Earlier this week, for instance, Iranian drone attacks halted all natural gas production in Qatar, and forced a suspension of operations at Saudi Arabia's largest oil refinery, Ras Tanura. This has also caused other countries to preemptively stop production, because there's less damage to repair if infrastructure is hit when it's not actively carrying oil or gas. Iraq, for instance, which typically accounts for about 5% of global oil production, recently suspended exports via a pipeline that runs to the port of Ceyhan in Turkey and would have provided an alternative export route. To make matters even worse, the disruption to global energy markets has triggered a wave of so-called energy nationalism, with countries halting exports to guarantee domestic supply. Thailand suspended all oil exports on March the 1st. China ordered its largest oil refineries to halt diesel and petrol exports on March the 5th, and a couple of Indian refiners have also halted exports, presumably at the request of the Indian government. The risk here is that this snowballs. Energy nationalism means more disruption to supply, which leads to more energy nationalism, etc. Anyway, that's energy. On to the second risk that the war poses to the global economy: disruption to global food markets. As we learnt a couple of years ago, when energy prices go up, food prices usually go up as well, because energy is a significant input in food production. But the war in Iran is extra bad for global food markets, because quite a lot of the world's fertilizer comes from the Middle East. For context, much of the world's fertilizer is produced via a process that involves natural gas, which is why there are quite a lot of fertilizer plants in and around the Middle East, nearby big gas producers, and why roughly a third of globally traded fertilizer passes through the Strait of Hormuz. Disruption to global gas supplies and shipping through the strait thus means higher fertilizer costs, and the price of urea, the world's most common fertilizer, has already risen 25% in the past couple of days. This comes at a particularly bad time for the global food cycle. In parts of Europe and the Northern Hemisphere, March and April are the start of fertilizer application season, and less fertilizer now will thus mean lower crop yields later in the year. Anyway, third and finally, the war presents a risk to the global economy. Of course, there's the general risk that all this geopolitical turmoil triggers anxiety-induced sell-offs in the stock market and other assets. We've already seen this in places, with especially sharp sell-offs in Asian markets. But there's also a more specific risk at play here, namely that increases in energy and food prices push up headline inflation, which triggers interest rate hikes, which could trigger a financial crisis. For context, as you might already know, for the past couple of years there's been a lot of talk about how, from certain angles, the US economy looks a bit bubbly, and might thus be at risk of some sort of financial crisis. We're not going to go into whether the US economy is actually a bubble right now, not least because that would require another video in itself. But the point we want to make here is that one of the things that's calmed investors' nerves is that, for the past couple of years, the US and other big economies have been cutting interest rates in response to falling inflation. This has calmed nerves, because historically financial crises usually happen when rates are going up, because that effectively makes it more expensive to borrow and thus increases the risk of debt-related crises. It's often forgotten today, but this is sort of what happened before 2008. In large part thanks to a rise in global energy prices, inflation rose steadily throughout the early 2000s, pushing central banks to hike interest rates, which basically peaked in 2007, just before the crisis. To be clear, we're not saying this is going to happen at all. But rate hikes would bring new risks, especially when parts of the so-called private credit market are already looking very shaky. As we mentioned earlier, the latest edition of our magazine Too Long is out very soon. And if you subscribe using code SPRING26, then you'll get your first copy for as little as £4.99, as well as 20% off every future issue as long as you stay subscribed. The latest issue features our ranking of the world's 25 most influential people, using ratings from you, our audience, as well as from our journalists. Inside, we not only reveal the full ranking, but the stories of a number of people who made the list, from the return of Donald Trump and the calculated moves of Xi Jinping to the AI frontiers of Sam Altman. We look at the new entries, New York's first Muslim mayor Zohran Mamdani, the radical shift of Pope Leo XIV, and bastion of technocracy Mark Carney, as well as the shadows that still linger, like Jeffrey Epstein. Across 72 pages, this issue of Too Long features a whole lot more than just that. We also have a cover story on how the UK became more divided than ever, and how a broken country could rebuild, the fragmentation emerging within the EU, how religion is being hijacked by politicians, as well as much, much more. You can pre-order your copy at toolong.news, and remember to use code SPRING26 for the best ever price.